The Tavern Keeper's Son. Thomas Blackwood had always been known for his quick temper, but on this particular autumn evening in 1847, his anger burned hotter than the coal fires warming the Red Lion Tavern. The 28-year-old blacksmith sat hunched over his fifth pint of ale, his calloused hands gripping the pewter mug so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Around him, the usual crowd of dock workers and merchants carried on their conversations, but Thomas heard none of it. His mind was consumed with rage over the news he had received just hours earlier. Earlier that day, Thomas had returned from the Royal Foundry where he worked as a metalsmith, crafting horseshoes and iron fittings for the Queen's stables. His supervisor, a stern man named William Fletcher, had pulled him aside with grave news. The foundry was cutting staff, and Thomas was among those being dismissed. After 12 years of loyal service, during which he had never missed a day of work and had earned commendations for his skill, he was being cast aside like a broken tool. The reason given was restructuring, but Thomas knew better. Fletcher had made it clear that the decision came from higher up, from men who wore fine uniforms and carried themselves with the arrogance of those born to privilege. The royal household was tightening its budget, and common workers like Thomas were considered expendable. His family's livelihood, his pride in his craft, his very identity as a skilled artisan, all of it was being stripped away by people who had never worked a day with their hands. Thomas drained his mug and slammed it down on the scarred wooden table. The sound echoed through the tavern, causing several patrons to glance in his direction. His friend Samuel, a carpenter who had known Thomas since childhood, placed a concerned hand on his shoulder. "Easy there, Tom," Samuel said quietly. "Drowning your troubles in ale won't bring your job back." "They think they can just throw us away like we're nothing," Thomas muttered, his words beginning to slur. 12 years, Sam. 12 years I gave them, and for what? So some pompous lord can save a few shillings on his accounts?" Samuel signaled to the barkeep to stop serving Thomas. But it was too late. The alcohol had already taken hold, mixing dangerously with the rage that had been building all day. Thomas's thoughts turned darker as he remembered Fletcher's dismissive tone, the way the man had avoided meeting his eyes when delivering the news. He thought about his wife, Margaret, 7 months pregnant with their second child, and how he would have to tell her that their small savings would have to last until he could find new employment. The tavern door swung open, letting in a gust of cold night air along with 2 figures in crisp red uniforms. Royal guards making their evening rounds, checking on the establishments near the palace grounds. Thomas's bloodshot eyes fixed on them immediately, and his jaw clenched. Here were the very symbols of the system that had just destroyed his life, men who drew steady wages from the royal treasury while honest workers were cast into the street. The guards were young, probably no older than 20, with the clean-shaven faces and straight postures of soldiers fresh from training. They moved through the tavern with the casual authority of their position, nodding politely to the barkeep and scanning the room with practiced eyes. Most patrons barely acknowledged them. Such visits were routine and generally peaceful. But Thomas saw something different. He saw representatives of a system that valued appearance over substance, privilege over merit. In his alcohol-clouded mind, these guards became the embodiment of everything that was wrong with the world. Young men who had been handed positions of authority, while experienced craftsmen like himself were discarded without thought. "Look at them," Thomas said loudly enough for half the tavern to hear. "Pretty uniforms and shiny buttons while good men lose their livelihoods to pay for their wages." Samuel tried to quiet his friend, but Thomas shrugged off his restraining hand. The ale had stripped away his usual caution, leaving only raw emotion and a desperate need to strike back at the forces that had wronged him. He stood up unsteadily, his considerable frame towering over the other patrons. At 6 feet tall and built from years of heavy labor, Thomas was an intimidating figure even in his current state. The guards noticed the disturbance and began moving in Thomas's direction, their hands resting casually on their sword hilts. They had dealt with drunken troublemakers before and expected this to be a routine matter of escorting an intoxicated patron outside to cool off. Neither of them could have imagined how far Thomas was prepared to go in his rage or how this encounter would spiral into something that would haunt all their lives forever. The older of the two guards, Corporal James Morrison, stepped forward with a diplomatic smile. "Evening, sir. Perhaps it's time you headed home to your family?" Thomas's response was swift and vicious. "Don't you dare speak to me about family, you arrogant whelp. What do you know about working for a living? About having everything you've built torn away by people like you?" The tavern fell silent. Even the most hardened patrons recognized that something dangerous was brewing. Corporal Morrison's partner, a young man named Edward Hayes, moved to flank Thomas while keeping his expression neutral. Both guards were trained to de-escalate situations, but they could see that this particular drunk was different. There was something wild and desperate in his eyes that went beyond mere alcohol. What happened next would change everything. Thomas, driven by a mixture of rage, desperation, and liquid courage, made a decision that would transform him from a wronged worker into something far darker. The first blow was already forming in his mind, but even he didn't yet realize how far his anger would carry him, or what terrible line he was about to cross. The breaking point. Thomas swung his massive fist without warning, catching Corporal Morrison squarely in the jaw. The sound of knuckles meeting bone echoed through the silent tavern like a gunshot. Morrison staggered backward, blood streaming from his split lip, his carefully maintained composure shattered along with his dignity. The other patrons gasped and began backing toward the walls, sensing that what they were witnessing was far more serious than a typical tavern brawl. Edward Hayes, Morrison's young partner, immediately drew his sword and pointed it at Thomas's chest. "Stand down. You're under arrest for assaulting a royal guard." But Thomas was beyond reason now. The alcohol had dissolved the last restraints of his common sense, and the satisfying impact of his fist against the guard's face had only fed his rage. He grabbed a heavy wooden chair and hurled it at Hayes, who barely managed to duck as it crashed against the wall behind him, splintering into pieces. "Arrest me?" Thomas roared, his voice carrying across the entire tavern. "For what? For being angry that you parasites live off the sweat of honest men? For caring more about my family than your precious royal protocol?" Morrison wiped the blood from his mouth and drew his own sword, though his hands were shaking slightly. Both guards were trained fighters, but they had never faced anything like this. A man who seemed completely willing to die rather than submit to their authority. The protocol was clear. Use minimum force necessary to subdue a civilian. But Thomas wasn't behaving like a typical civilian anymore. Samuel made one last desperate attempt to intervene. "Tom, please, think about Margaret and little Annie. Don't throw your life away." For a moment, Thomas hesitated. The mention of his family seemed to pierce through the haze of alcohol and fury. His wife, Margaret, was at home, probably putting their 4-year-old daughter Annie to bed, unaware that her husband was about to destroy everything they had left. But then Morrison took a step forward, and the sight of that red uniform reignited Thomas's rage with even greater intensity. "My family?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "They've already destroyed my family. At least now I can take some of these royal dogs with me." What happened next horrified everyone present. Thomas grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace and swung it like a club. Morrison tried to parry with his sword, but the poker's weight and Thomas's desperate strength overwhelmed his defense. The iron bar struck the side of Morrison's head with a sickening crack, and the young corporal collapsed to the floor, his sword clattering away across the wooden planks. Hayes lunged forward with his blade, managing to slice across Thomas's forearm, but the blacksmith barely seemed to notice the wound. Instead, he grabbed Hayes by the throat with one massive hand and began choking him, lifting the smaller man off his feet. Hayes's face turned red, then purple, as he clawed desperately at Thomas's grip while trying to bring his sword to bear. The tavern erupted in chaos. Women screamed, men shouted for help, and the barkeep ran toward the door to summon more guards. But Thomas was lost in a red haze of violence that seemed to grow stronger with each passing second. He could hear Hayes making choking sounds, could feel the young man's pulse racing beneath his fingers, and instead of being horrified by what he was doing, he felt a savage satisfaction. "This is what happens when you push a man too far," Thomas bellowed to the terrified crowd. "This is what happens when you take everything from someone who's got nothing left to lose." Morrison was stirring weakly on the floor, blood pooling beneath his head, but he was in no condition to help his partner. Hayes's struggles were growing weaker as oxygen deprivation took its toll. His sword arm went limp, and the blade fell from his nerveless fingers. It was then that Thomas made the decision that would damn him forever. Looking down at Hayes's purple face, seeing the terror and desperation in the young man's eyes, Thomas felt no pity. Instead, he felt only the intoxicating rush of absolute power. Here was someone who represented everything he hated, and that person's life was literally in his hands. Samuel and two other patrons finally found the courage to intervene, rushing forward to try to pull Thomas away from Hayes. But the blacksmith had spent years developing his strength through hard labor, and in his current state he seemed to possess almost superhuman power. He shoved Samuel away so hard that the carpenter crashed into a table, then backhanded another man with such force that the patron's nose exploded in a spray of blood. Hayes was barely conscious now, his eyes rolling back as his body went limp. Any reasonable person would have released him, would have recognized that they had gone too far. But Thomas's rage had evolved into something darker and more terrible. He had crossed a line from which there could be no return, and instead of stepping back, he chose to keep moving forward into the darkness. The sound of running footsteps echoed from outside as more guards responded to the barkeep's call for help. Thomas heard them coming, and he knew his time was running out. But instead of trying to escape or surrender, he made a choice that would shock even the hardened soldiers who were about to burst through the tavern door. He looked down at Hayes's unconscious form and smiled. Then he reached for the fallen guard's sword, testing its weight in his hand. Morrison was trying to crawl toward the door, leaving a trail of blood behind him, and Thomas realized he had the opportunity to finish what he had started. The guards burst through the tavern door just as Thomas raised the sword above Morrison's defenseless body. What they saw in that moment would haunt them for the rest of their lives, not just the violence, but the expression of pure, savage joy on Thomas's face as he prepared to commit an act that would transform him from an angry drunk into a cold-blooded killer. "Stop!" the lead guard shouted, but Thomas only laughed. He had found something in this moment of absolute power that made all his previous suffering seem worthwhile. And he wasn't ready to give it up. The point of no return. The sword came down with devastating force, but not where the horrified guards expected. At the last second, Thomas shifted his aim, driving the blade deep into the wooden floor just inches from Morrison's head. The metallic ring of steel biting into oak filled the sudden silence as everyone in the tavern held their breath. Morrison's eyes went wide with terror as he stared at the quivering blade that had nearly ended his life. Thomas straightened up slowly, savoring the absolute power he held over everyone in the room. 6 additional guards had poured through the doorway, their weapons drawn and ready, but none dared to move. Hayes lay unconscious at Thomas's feet. Morrison was bleeding and helpless on the floor, and the civilian population cowered against the walls. For the first time since receiving news of his dismissal, Thomas felt in complete control. "That's right," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "Now you know what it feels like to be helpless. To have your fate decided by someone who doesn't care about you as a person." Sergeant William Crawford, the senior guard present, stepped forward carefully. He was a veteran of 15 years' service, and he had seen men break before, but never quite like this. Thomas wasn't just violent, he was methodical, calculating, and clearly enjoying every moment of the terror he was creating. "Release the guards, and we can discuss your grievances," Crawford said evenly. "Whatever wrong has been done to you, this isn't the way to address it." Thomas laughed, a sound devoid of any humor. "Discuss my grievances? Like the way my supervisor discussed my dismissal? Like the way the royal household discusses the lives of working men when they balance their ledgers?" He reached down and grabbed Morrison by his uniform collar, hauling the semi-conscious guard to his feet. Morrison swayed unsteadily, blood still trickling from his head wound, but Thomas held him upright with casual strength. With his free hand, Thomas picked up Morrison's fallen sword. "Here's what we're going to do," Thomas announced, pressing the blade against Morrison's throat. "You're going to send a message to whoever made the decision to cast me and my fellow workers aside. You're going to tell them that Thomas Blackwood demands an audience with someone who has the authority to restore our positions." Crawford exchanged glances with his men. They all knew this was impossible. The royal household didn't negotiate with criminals, especially not ones who had assaulted guards. But they also knew that any sudden movement could result in Morrison's death. "And if they refuse?" Crawford asked. Thomas's smile grew wider and more terrifying. "Then I start sending them pieces of your pretty uniforms, starting with the men wearing them." The threat hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Everyone present understood that they were no longer dealing with a simple drunk who had lost his temper. Thomas had evolved into something far more dangerous, a man who had discovered that violence gave him a power he had never possessed through honest labor. Hayes began to stir at Thomas's feet, coughing weakly as consciousness returned. Thomas glanced down at him with the casual interest of a cat observing a wounded mouse. "Ah, Sleeping Beauty awakens," Thomas said cheerfully. "How do you feel, boy? That's what it's like to have someone more powerful than you decide whether you live or die. Educational, isn't it?" Hayes tried to speak, but could only produce a raspy whisper. His throat bore the clear imprint of Thomas's fingers, already darkening into ugly bruises. The young guard's eyes were filled with a mixture of pain, fear, and something else, a loss of innocence that came from realizing how quickly a normal evening could transform into a nightmare. Thomas seemed to feed off that fear, his posture becoming more confident with each passing moment. He had discovered something intoxicating about wielding absolute power over other human beings. And the rational part of his mind that might have pulled him back from the brink had been completely overwhelmed by this new sensation. "You know what the real problem is?" Thomas continued conversationally, as if he were discussing the weather rather than holding a man's life in his hands. "People like you never have to face consequences. You hide behind your uniforms and your authority, making decisions that destroy lives, and you never have to look into the eyes of the people you've hurt." Crawford was quietly signaling to his men, trying to coordinate a response that might save Morrison's life. But Thomas caught the subtle hand gestures and tightened his grip on the sword. "No, no, Sergeant, no heroic rescues today. We're going to see this through to its natural conclusion." What Thomas didn't realize was that his actions had already set in motion a chain of events that would extend far beyond this single night. Word of the incident was spreading through the city, carried by patrons who had fled the tavern in terror. Within hours, the story would reach not just the royal household, but also Thomas's own neighborhood, where his wife Margaret would learn that her husband had transformed from a dismissed worker into something monstrous. But in this moment, surrounded by terrified guards and cowering civilians, Thomas felt more alive than he had in years. The powerlessness that had consumed him since losing his job had been replaced by an intoxicating sense of control. He had forced people to listen to him, to take him seriously, to fear him. The sword trembled slightly in his hand as he pressed it more firmly against Morrison's throat. A thin line of blood appeared where the edge bit into skin. Morrison's breathing became rapid and shallow, but he forced himself to remain still, knowing that any sudden movement could trigger his own death. "Please," Morrison whispered. "I have a wife, a baby daughter." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, everyone thought they might reach whatever humanity remained in Thomas. His own wife was pregnant. His own daughter was sleeping safely at home, unaware that her father was about to cross a line from which there could be no return. But instead of softening, Thomas's expression hardened further. The mention of Morrison's family only reminded him of his own vulnerability, his own fears about providing for those he loved. And in his twisted state of mind, he blamed Morrison and everything he represented for putting that family at risk. "Now you understand," Thomas said softly. "Now you know what it's like to fear for your family's future." And with those words, he made the final decision that would seal all their fates. The Thomas who had entered the tavern as a wronged worker was gone forever, replaced by someone capable of acts that would shock even himself when he finally sobered up. But that reckoning lay hours in the future, and for now, he had work to finish.